Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next episode of Themes and Variations, the Aldous Huxley podcast, a production of the Aldous Huxley Centre Zurich, featuring me, Tobias Harris, the Centre's curator and author of Aldous Huxley for Beginners, Robin Hull, along with Emily Reed and our invited guests. Today, we'll be extending our discussion of Huxley's ends and means by looking at how Huxley would take on the issue of billionaire business people that exert a great degree of political influence and through the technologies that they develop and control, perhaps even our day-to-day life. Welcome back to the podcast. Robin, how are you? How was your summer?
Fine, thanks. Wonderful.
Excellent, excellent. I'm pleased to be talking with you again. So, we're going to delve into a topic which I know is of some personal interest to you in terms of this idea of the moral quandary that someone with a great degree of wealth and influence might find themselves sitting in. How do you be a positive force for society? And I wanted to start by talking about Aldous Huxley and the capitalist system overall, if you like it. So, my understanding is, although he was sort of reluctantly political as a very young man, events involving the First World War encouraged Huxley to become a Fabian socialist. So he didn't necessarily reject the idea of an elite class controlling society, but perhaps he did reject the idea that anyone could become quite powerful simply by being successful in business. He kind of felt there were other criteria that were important. I'm thinking of the enormous influence of Vilfredo Pareto's treatise on sociology on Huxley and the way that Pareto equates the potential for democracy with plutocracy. If you have an open field, an open market, then what happens is you just get plutocracy. I think Pareto is known for saying, and this is prior to the rise of fascism in Italy, that it would only take, 10 strong men to clear out the plutocrats who were in control in Italy at that time. So there's obviously a certain attitude to the capitalist system and democracy that we need to calibrate here. So I wanted to ask, as a starting point, what do you think Huxley felt about the ability to become rich overall, and perhaps what he felt about the system of production for profit, the capitalist system itself?
Huxley always considered himself as being on the fringes of a capitalist society. He never felt included in the world of the rich, nor did he feel included in the world of the aristocracy of the upper classes. He was a welcome guest, but he wasn't part of that level of society. At university and in the 20s, he would have leaned more to the left of the Fabian circle. And in the early 30s, he went from a not very committed Fabian to what he calls a philosophic anarchist, which he became by the time he wrote Ends and Means. And he remained that way until he died. If one thinks about the implications of what he says about capitalism in nearly all of his works, for instance, he says that there should be private property, yes, but oil fields and steel plants shouldn't be owned by individuals. Therefore, big capital is what Huxley regards as an existential threat to humanity. So somewhere in the middle there, you have his views of economics. And in his final Utopia Island, the best salary, the highest salary, I think is a multiple of the lowest salary. I think it's a factor of 12 or 20, I can't remember, but that's about as much as someone ought to receive in pay and implicitly, therefore, in capital. Well, he never actually takes up the cudgels for socialism explicitly. He never says we should nationalize coal, steel, and oil. On the other hand, if you look at the sort of billionaires in his works. And the first billionaire is probably Lord Badgery in the Tillotson Banquet. That's a 1922 version of what becomes Lord Tantamount in Point Counterpoint in 1928. Well, from Badgery, there's a series of billionaires right through Huxley's works to Lord Aldehyde, Joe Aldehyde in Ireland, and Colonel Deeper. So you've got a whole genealogy of billionaires in Huxley's work. It's surprising because I thought, where are the billionaires? Is it just Henry Ford in Brave New World? No, there's loads of them.
There are loads of them, and I want to talk about those billionaires, but I think where I just want to return briefly to the point you made about Huxley and his economics and ask, why did Huxley not call explicitly for nationalization of those resources if he felt that they should be under some kind of state or democratic control? Because of course he lived through multiple nationalizations of such industries in different countries in different ways, so he would have seen it firsthand. So would you say that that makes his politics a kind of, could he be accused of a kind of quietism, I suppose, if he's unwilling to make a call? I just want to ask why he wouldn't do that.
Presumably because he was equally critical of the state taking over control of big capital. And he was worried that statism carried to extremes, as in the case of Stalin's Soviet Union, wouldn't be a great blessing for humanity either. So I suspect he didn't say too much. He didn't offer ready solutions because he wasn't sure he had them himself. What he was more confident about was that a decentralized society, a deglobalized society, would probably be less war prone than a centralized society of any description. But what happens when you nationalize coal, steel, and oil? You get, of course, a statism, and you concentrate capital in the hands of bureaucrats and an administration. And I'm sure I can positively say that Huxley wasn't a great friend of that scenario either.
Absolutely. I think that was worth stopping on just so we understand the reasoning, and it makes a lot of sense to me. So back to the billionaires in Huxley's work. Um, I like that you're identifying potentially some models as well for who these people are. But if we think of the tantamounts in Point Counterpoint, well, that's interesting, isn't it? Because there's obviously issues with the behavior and attitude of the Tantamounts, and you could argue that Lord Tantamount believes that he has a right and almost a duty to interfere in politics. It kind of reminds me of Ishiguro's Remains of the Day and how that kind of connects to that era, of these very wealthy figures who felt that they needed to intervene in the national interest. But of course, the Tantamounts are also great kind of sponsors of science, amateur scientists and almost patrons, I suppose, of a certain kind. So, what do you think that Huxley's trying to say with these depictions of the very, very wealthy, the billionaires of his time in his fiction?
Well, what unites the billionaires, and I mean by that the first generation billionaires, the ones who build up the fortunes of a family. In Huxley's thinking, they are mesomorphs. There's a constitutional aspect there. In other words, they are humans who are very much in the body. They're not necessarily the greatest intellectuals, and they are emotionally, as a rule, not too deep. They love power, they love bullying, they love dominating. So those are the sort of self-made billionaires, the billionaires who are active in power politics, like Cardinal Richelieu, by the way. We have to include him in our list of billionaires in Huxley, in grey eminence, right? He's the sort of classic type of the power-loving mesomorph. And then you have Joe Stoit in After Many a Summer Dies a Swan. He's a sort of self-made American gangster type billionaire who is in the end quite lovable in a way, as he becomes the victim of the story. And then there's Joe Aldehyde in Ireland, who is in fact helping Huxley's utopia to be destroyed by another mesomorph billionaire dictator, Colonel Deeper. So you've got that kind of bully. They build the fortunes, they build the empires, they love power, and then you've got the heirs. And the heirs, that's Lord Tantamount, who is asked by his father to enter politics, but reads Claude Bernard's book on experimental medicine instead and decides to become a scientist. There's Lucy Tantamount, who doesn't take the slightest interest in making money. There's also Myra Viviash in Antique Hay. Those are the heirs. And the billionaire heirs, they range from irresistibly attractive female sirens like Lucy and Myra, modeled on Nancy Cunard, as we all know. She was a billionaire heiress. Well, to charmingly eccentric aristocrats like Lord Badgery in the Tillotson Banquet or Lord Tantamount in Point Counterpoint. So that's the sort of range that we're talking about. It's interesting that these billionaires very often take an interest in spiritualism, which is something Huxley detested. He was neither, he felt this, didn't feel the slightest affinity to theosophy or occultism, and that's exactly what captivates the billionaires in Huxley's work.
That is quite interesting, that distinction. There's a sense of this link between the billionaires and spiritualism, occultism, kind of otherworldliness that huge wealth creates. So on the one hand, you've either yourself become very powerful and built an empire through various unscrupulous means, or you've inherited that kind of material empire in the world, but yet there's a counterbalance, which is they're driven towards these otherworldly ideas. The reason I mention this is because it seems to connect to what you might describe as the off-world aspirations of contemporary billionaires now. So the thing that they all compete to do is to launch rockets into space.
Well, yes, you see, these self-made or active billionaires in Huxley's works, just about without exception, wreak havoc. Huxley regarded Hitler and Mussolini and Stalin as symptoms of a mesomorph revolution. If the mesomorph, the power-loving bully, ran unchecked, the world would potentially face destruction. In Brave New World, Henry Ford, one of the iconic self-made billionaires, destroys humanity by re-engineering it genetically. And in Ireland, Joe Aldehyde, together with Colonel Deeper, destroy Huxley's ideal world. So the billionaire, even if he means well, wreaks havoc. Cardinal Richelieu started wars which led to the destruction of a third of the population of Europe in the 17th century. So that's, I think, how billionaires are seen. They're seen as a lethal threat to humanity.
Hello, and if you are watching this podcast, you will see that Toby and I are sat in the recreation of Huxley's library, the one that was burnt down in the fire, holding our Huxley-inspired tea mugs. My mug says, "Thank Ford, it's tea time."
And these are available if you visit the oldest Huxley Centre
In
in
Zurich.
which is also the font of this podcast, which is why we pay homage to it by virtually being there.
Fantastic.
But you're probably listening, so you're none the wiser.
It's important context.
Imagine, just imagine, imagine that we're in front of his library, we're holding some cool Aldous Huxley Brave New World mugs.
So in this segment today, we are going to be doing something. It feels we often do something a little bit different, and this is no exception. Today, we are going to be asking the question as to what Huxley would have thought about artificial intelligence. It's a very obviously a very hot topic at the moment, a lot of people with lots of different opinions on it. So we thought we would add the Huxley spin on this current debate. And we are in fact going to be asking Huxley himself. Would you believe it? Toby has spent a lot of time putting together a Huxley AI chatbot for your delight, entertainment, and education. So, Toby, do you want to talk about how you built this AI chatbot?
Mm-hmm. Yep. So this is a RAG system, a retrieval augmented generation system. And that's when you basically take like a large language model like Claude or ChatGPT and you point it at a specific data set, a specific database, in fact, and tell it to only retrieve information from that database and use that in its responses. So we've got a couple of options. We can either ask this chatbot to respond in the persona of Aldous Huxley, which of course we'll do, or we can just ask it to just respond in scholarly mode. Either way, what it's going to do is take the query and it's going to run a search across a bunch of different works by Aldous Huxley, and then it's going to turn that into an answer that's crafted after the stylings of Aldous Huxley according to a prompt.
Oh, exciting. And if you are watching the podcast, you'd see that we have a list of Huxley's major works down the left side of the screen. And on the main portion of the screen, we have a chatbot style interface, not unlike ChatGPT or any other of your AI models.
And if you are watching, you can see me do this, or if you're listening, you'd be able to see me type, what would you say about AI? Or what would you say about artificial intelligence, Gen AI, or LLMs? And we're going to see what happens. Live demo. The tension's not there for the people listening, but it is for the people watching.
And it is certainly for us. Okay, so we're searching and generating a response. It needs elevator music.
Yeah, it does. It does. Or some kind of little GIF of like Huxley. Maybe Huxley flapping his arms in a circle, waving his arms and moving in a slow circle. Okay. All right. We have a response. The response is drawn from, as we mentioned, from this set of Huxley texts with the LLM doing its best job of pretending to be Huxley to give us an answer. So what does Huxley say about AI?
Shall I read out?
Yeah, read it out. Yeah.
Okay. So AI Huxley says, I must say plainly that the specific technologies you mention, artificial intelligence, generative AI, and large language models, do not appear in my writings, as they emerged well after my time. However, the fundamental questions they raise about human nature, technology's proper role, and the preservation of individual consciousness were central concerns throughout my work. My position on any such technology would depend entirely on how it affects human development and spiritual consciousness. I have consistently argued that technological inventions that tend to replace warm human contact must be suspect. The crucial test is whether these systems serve to produce free individuals or whether they become an end in itself rather than a proper means. This is an interesting answer. From what I understand of these technologies, they appear to process and recombine vast quantities of human expression. Much as my character Shearwater could run an expert experiment and collect data while losing all sense of empathy and passion. The danger lies not in the technical capability itself, but in mistaking such processing for genuine understanding or creativity. I would be particularly concerned about any use of these systems that encourages intellectual passivity or reduces the need for individual thought and spiritual development. Social reform, as I have argued, always needed to be judged by the effect, positive or negative, on the human condition. If these technologies foster dependency rather than enhancing human capacity for imaginative creativity and honest emotion, they move us closer to the totalitarian welfare tyranny I depicted in Brave New World. The fundamental question remains, Do these tools help awaken consciousness, or do they further mechanize human experience? Human beings are not machines, and they cannot be subjected to machine-like efficiency without suffering essential losses. Any technology that promises to think for us, rather than helping us think more clearly, deserves our deepest suspicion. So AI Huxley is an AI skeptic.
Yeah, AI Huxley is concerned about AI, which I think is interesting in itself, that the AI has been able to model a skeptical opinion about the technology that it represents, but that's not necessarily so surprising. So I think it's interesting because this is the second or third time we've run this question, and each time the responses are quite different, but each time they're also clearly rooted in what Huxley really had to say about different things. And in this case, it's focused much more on what he had to say about technology in general.
Yes, yeah.
In previous runs, it's focused on what he had to say about intelligence in general. In this case, I do think that Huxley is almost saying something to us which is very, very prescient. I mean, there's two parts really. The first is whether they will produce for individuals or whether they become an end in itself.
Yes, indeed.
Because if we think of the cycle of investment and growth and building and further investment and development that's happening around these big AI companies, all while they're really searching for what the technology is really for, then there is a risk that, you know, AI is becoming an end in itself and that it's consuming loads of data, it's draining water supplies in areas where there's large data centers. So he's kind of got a point there.
Well, that is really, it's a good point to make as well, because there are obvious environmental, social, and governance concerns with AI models and the amount of power that they consume, the amount of energy that they require in order to run, and the fact that these companies are aimed at growth more so than anything else, really, in a very obviously capitalistic model of operation. Whereas it seems to me that Huxley would be more in favor, perhaps, of a tool that enables us to, or helps us to think, but one that is maybe more localized, small scale, within a collective ownership of a small voluntary entered group of people. So I think that the scaffolding around AI as well in its current form would be quite concerning to Huxley.
Yeah, I agree. He would definitely see this technology as a means of making new billionaires and, you know, being controlled by these huge, gigantic multinational corporations as being fundamentally problematic. And it seems to be quoting actually from texts like Ends and Means, where that kind of discussion is quite explicit. But just on that point about helping us to think, he also says in his response that he'd be particularly concerned of any use of these systems that encourages intellectual passivity or reduces the need for individual thought and spiritual development. That's quite interesting because people are already concerned, deeply concerned, and there's many studies to show this about what's been described as AI cognitive impairment, whereby the reliance on AI to perform certain tasks, like, you know, writing an email or something like that, is producing a level of cognitive impairment where people are losing the ability to do these things. In fact, losing the ability somewhat to think and reason for themselves.
Indeed. So things like essay writing, if you're in the academic space, or email writing or creating slide decks more in the corporate space, these things require, or these things allow us to offload our knowledge to a process, to the artificial intelligence. And so actually we're not cultivating or curating this internalized, embedded, deep knowledge about the thing that we are producing artifacts about, thereby, I think, risking losing our autonomy as thinking, creative human beings.
On the other hand, well, firstly, doesn't what we've done here present a very clear example of the sort of danger of AI in that sense, in that what we have here is something that can be used as a substitute for original research. because we've got all these answers about this topic, and we've also got references to the source passages where it's pulled out this material or where it's learned this from. And so actually we've shortcutted the process. So that's one aspect of this. But the other is that kind of shortcut actually helpful, because it means that we're able to query a lot of text at the same time that would take hours and hours and hours to read.
Absolutely. And I think that I would maybe speak up for AI Huxley a little bit, despite my my earlier comments, that what I would almost say is that this functions very well as a starting point, because actually in our discussions about Huxley and AI, we have spoken about a lot of things that is in fact not in the answer.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that there's definitely a case to be made for tools such as this to be able to kickstart research, to be able to give you a starting point for discussion, to be able to, yes, consult lots of different books and articles more quickly than a person could, but that is a starting point for discussion and conversation. And of course, it comes with all the caveat that it it seems to me just reasonable to expect that a human working with artificial intelligence would check the output. And it's quite a nice feature of AI Huxley that it does flag whenever it quotes something, and it provides where it found that quote within the database. So it is good that it has that level of transparency. So I think it's better to think about these things as things that you work with, rather than something that creates independent thought, independent argument on a sustained and deep level.
One of the parts that I wanted to touch upon, which I think you're really drawing out perfectly there, it's to do with the very title of the book we've been focused on for the past few discussions, isn't it? Ends and means. The ends of billionaires are not necessarily bad, although, arguably in books like Grey Eminence, the sort of bankruptcy of certain religious aspirations is revealed and the link to power is very clear. But nevertheless, it's the problem of the centralization of power and of any one person's dream. If that becomes the reality for everyone, then for a significant proportion of people, that's going to be a nightmare. So it's not necessarily that Huxley opposes, some of the things that these billionaires might stand for. It's more the question of the form of the relationship that takes with society. Because I think this is very much a challenge that's with us today, in that we have lots of noble aims that are hard to disagree with. We have the idea, the wish to be connected, the wish for technologies to be used to improve our lives, the wish for medicines to be available to everyone. And yet somehow, when those aspirations get concentrated in the hands of very few, the outcomes don't seem to be as good anymore. And it feels like in the act of assuming control over society, you actually destroy it in some way. Another way to frame this question back to you is, it's not as straightforward as billionaires bad, non-billionaires good in this world, because he also has these kind of more positive figures, as he mentioned, the kind of heirs and heiresses of billionaires who might be sponsors of the arts or patrons of science and so on, and might be useful figures. And so that you can't separate Huxley's thinking from the levers of power, from people who were powerful, from people he did interact with. He was part of, a bit like the rest of the, well, I wouldn't say the rest of, a bit like the Bloomsbury set with whom he did socialize and associate. He was, as you said at the beginning, peripheral to the ruling class. He was welcome in amongst the ruling class, but not a co-thinker of it, not an unashamed, kind of supporter of its aims or goals, certainly askance from them. I guess I just want to focus on that ambiguity, that ambivalence of his relationship. It suggests that the things that billionaires might be supportive of aren't always completely bad, but they obviously tip out of kilter and become very bad as soon as they become the subject of one person's quest for ultimate power.
Again, anything I say now will raise more questions than I think I'm able to answer. For instance, if you look at the billionaires in Huxley's complete works, psychologically, they are without exception asleep, or if you like, unregenerate. They're completely imprisoned in their egos. And no real reason is given by Huxley why this might be the case. But we just have to accept the fact that the billionaires that we encounter in Huxley, including Cardinal Richelieu, even if they mean well, Richelieu wants to save France and, avert the disaster of being conquered by the Habsburgs in Austria or the Spaniards and Philip of Spain. Well, um, that's actually probably a valid aim from the point of view of France, isn't it? Or Henry Ford wants to make the economy so well-oiled and optimize the processes of production to enable humanity to live in a state of relative leisure, shorten the working day. So the problem is that there isn't a single enlightened billionaire in Huxley's works. All the people who are somehow not imprisoned by their egos, not what Huxley calls unregenerate, they're on the fringes. And grey eminence is a warning to intellectuals and mystics not to get involved with power politics and big capital for fear of becoming an accomplice. The intellectual who tries to get involved with billionaires in Huxley's works is very often, in the end, an accomplice. Obispo, for instance, is a very willing accomplice in After Many a Summer Dies, the Swan. He's a very willing accomplice and even takes over the management of the billionaire. He bullies him in the end. He bullies the bully. And Will Farnaby in Ireland is an accomplice of Joe Aldehyde, actually, and helps this ideal society to come crashing down. It's tragic. So the thing about these billionaires is that they are apparently in a hopeless situation. They're unable to discover their true selves. And because they are so blind to who they are, they do an awful lot of damage with the power they have.
I think that's actually a great way to respond to that particular question. And coming back to that question of damage, I think one of the areas I wanted to talk about was more to do with the intersection of politics and technology and information. So in Ends and Means on page 64 of the edition that most people would get a hold of, it says, no country can be really well prepared for modern war unless it is governed by a tyrant at the head of a highly trained and perfectly obedient bureaucracy. And that makes me think of the involvement of very powerful individuals in the war and the weapons industry. And it also makes me think of the uncomfortable story of Thomas Watson. He was very much a epitome of the self-made figure, kind of worked his way up through the ranks of IBM, transformed it into the modern sales machine that it became, inventing lots of, modern commercial practices, but then became hopelessly involved in the technology that underpinned World War II in terms of the punch card machines, the hollow-reef machines that were used initially by Nazi Germany and then ultimately by all sides in the war as they sought to gain, advantage. And IBM found itself in this position of selling the technology to everyone at the same time through its different subsidiaries, and therefore, I guess, indirectly fueling the conflict when that was a lever that could have been pulled, to end the conflict if they'd been willing to do it, or to at least to hasten maybe Germany's defeat. So Huxley suggests there's this connection between preparing for war and centralized power. Because if you're ready for war, you need centralized power. And even in, democratic countries such as the ones we're dialing in from, you still see the same effect. The more the threat of war is there, the more centralization is needed, the more large investments there need to be in secret weapons programs, the more technology you need. It just creates, what, of course, Eisenhower famously referred to as a military industrial complex. And I wanted to just touch on that because you've mentioned the case in Ireland with Joe Aldehyde and his complicity in the war, effectively. It's a very short war to destroy the utopia of Parla. And I'm thinking that is one way to read a politics into Huxley's sense of billionaires, because he's well aware of this kind of loop that goes around where you have weapons industries and you have centralized power, and it's all justified by war, by the threat of war, which Huxley says several times is not really about political interest so much as emotion, so much as, passions that are being organized, like you said, the kind of mesomorph passions for power and conquest. So I don't know if you can shed any light on what Huxley would have thought about the involvement of billionaires in that kind of war machine.
So, for instance, in Ireland, we can be fairly certain that Joe Aldehyde has all sorts of other interests in business, not just oil, and that it's in all likelihood heavy industry and therefore also weapons production. Weapons production relies on heavy industry and on big capital and on large-scale production. And Huxley's utopia is an ideal society in which these things are not possible because the state, the centralized state, has wilted away. And the way it comes about in Ireland is through what one might regard as a philosopher king who has enough clout to force any central administration in his own kingdom to wilt away. um, so that's how actually Parla appears. And then there's Maoist China that's invoked in Ireland. In other words, the communist alternative to big capital and mass production of weapons. And we should also mention that the centralization of power to Huxley is a necessity if a country calls itself a nation. Huxley defines nation as an institution which wages war. Once nationalism enters the scene, it's certain to want to wage war. So it's not just big capital, it's nationalism. And those are phenomena that we're now seeing these days. Then there's the aspect of applied science. If in the hands of the wrong people, power-loving billionaires or dictators, applied science, of course, becomes the instrument with which mankind destroys itself, as in the case of Ape and Essence in the dystopia Huxley wrote in 1948 following Hiroshima.
And that's interesting. That's a very direct response to Hiroshima in some ways, isn't it? Looking at for what the difficult question of what an aftermath looks like to that kind of nuclear apocalypse on a global scale. Well, this has been a really fascinating discussion. I want to end on a slightly potentially facetious point. I don't know, but it feels like something that's worth bringing up because it's obvious that we live in a world much like Huxley did, where there are a small number of billionaires who do wield enormous power, and these days they do so by their control over systems of communication that Huxley would have been hugely interested in himself. They help to control the internet services that we use that connect us with other people and with products. And so they kind of almost control a market of information. They have a centralized power over that. And all of these billionaires have their own aspirations for how they're going to make the world a better place. And they also will have the capability to do enormous damage as well. So let's turn to the contemporary. What kind of advice do you think Huxley would try to give, or what kind of critique do you think Huxley would make of the current class of billionaires, because it's true that we don't exactly live in the same world of apocalyptic kind of battles and ground warfare, or the same fascism does not look like it did, in Huxley's time. So it's a bit different, I think. Maybe a bit more similar to Brave New World than
Yeah.
Huxley's time.
Well, I think Huxley would have been fascinated by artificial intelligence, by robotics, and by all the potentialities of sustainable energy, self-piloting cars, trips to Mars, and so forth. And I think he would have responded to the present day situation as a satirist, cautioning us and the billionaires maybe in question not to be too confident that we can improve the world as we are. In other words, in our state of hypnotic sleep, in our egoism that we are so entrapped in. Well, I think he would have, if he were alive and had the energy, he'd feel the moment might have come for an updated version of Brave New World, perhaps a Brave New Universe, in which all these dreams of rescuing humanity to Mars and things like that were satirized just as mercilessly as they are in Brave New World. In other words, I think he would have done a wonderful job on, say, Elon Musk, a job that is easily as good as the job he did on Henry Ford. And it's amusing that nearly every young reader who reads Brave New World these days sees similarities between Ford and Musk.
Yes, amusing, maybe not entirely surprising as well at the same time. That's a fantastic point to end on. So once again, Robin, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.